Welcome to Presidential Fight Club, the show that answers the question, if all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Welcome to the third fight of round 2 of the Western Regional. We're going to see two presidents that, depending on how old you are within living memory. One of them is Ronald Reagan, and he's going up against our returning champion, LBJ. What does Ronald the Gipper bring to the fight, James?
Ronald Reagan. Well, he is very interesting fellow, of course, in many ways. He's our only president that started out his life as an actor, although we're going to talk about what he did even before he was an actor. He was one of the fittest presidents that we've ever had, believe it or not, despite his age. When he was elected president in 1980, he was the oldest person at that time to ever be elected president. Now, of course, Donald Trump has passed him up. Trump was 1 year older than Reagan. Reagan was 69. Trump was actually 70 when he was elected. But Reagan was in a fitness fanatic all of his life. His focus on fitness and athleticism started early. As a teenager, he worked as a lifeguard. And of course, anybody that's been a lifeguard knows that you work very, very hard. You have to be in tip-top physical shape. Like my brother-in-law is 61, and he was a champion swimmer back when he was in high school and college, and he recently decided to try his hand at lifeguarding, and he found out that they had to do like an hour or maybe it's 2 hours of exercise every morning before their job. That's part of the job. They had to. Now, it was probably different back when Ronald Reagan was a lifeguard, but still, you have to be a top-notch swimmer. And swimming is very, very invigorating. It's very challenging. It's very strenuous. Reagan saved the lives of over 70 people, 77 to be exact, during his tenure as a lifeguard, which stretched over several years. And I read recently that not only was he a lifeguard, but when he was working as a lifeguard, part of his duties were waking up every day and chopping a 300-pound block of ice down into a 100-pound block of ice. Not exactly sure why that was required, but he did it 7 days a week. And so like Lincoln, I mean, Reagan was always swinging, I guess in this case, I don't know if it would be an axe or a hammer, but he was always chopping things. And so that makes you very, very strong. I know when I try to chop anything and swing any kind of axe or anything, after about 3 swings, I'm about done. I'm ready to take a break. But and Reagan had a lifelong love of chopping wood. There's a funny anecdote, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a funny story that it ought to be true if it's not. When he was in the hospital after he had been shot, and we'll talk about that later, but he was in the hospital and there was this sound of somebody chopping wood outside, and one of the doctors says, "Go out there and tell that idiot to stop chopping wood. He's going to disturb the president." And the other doctor looks out the window and says, "Oh, that is the president." So Reagan was strong, very, very, very strong as an ox. When he was in high school and in college, he played football. He was very, very very athletic. His most famous movie role was as another great athlete, or even greater athlete, probably George Gipp, in the movie Knute Rockne All-American. I think it came out in 1940. I actually have that on DVD. It's a pretty good movie. And but he didn't just play football players. He really was a football player. And one other thing I'll say about Reagan, when the war broke out, World War II that is, he desperately wanted to volunteer, and he went and signed up, and they gave him an eye test, and it turned out he was almost as blind as a bat. I mean, Reagan had terrible vision, and so he'd wanted to be a pilot. So they said, well, you know what? If you can't hardly see 3 feet in front of you, you better not be a pilot. That's not a real good idea. So he was very disappointed because he wanted to be a pilot, but they said, well, you're an actor, right? By this time, he had already been acting, and this was actually after Knute Rockne All-American. And Yeah, I'm an actor. And they said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you to work making basically propaganda movies, patriotic movies that people will see, and it'll pump up war spirit and make people want to give money to buy bonds, war bonds. And so Reagan actually spent the war pretending to be a soldier or pretending to be a pilot, or different. He pretended to be different branches. But so he helped build morale at home, even though he was not allowed to go out and fight in the actual war. So that's what we'll go with for Reagan right now. Tough guy.
We're taking a second look at LBJ. He's someone that I am absolutely fascinated by. First, I'll just mention his physicality, but it's his personality that really gets me. Okay, like James mentioned, he's a big Texan. He's 6'3", 6'4", weighed 210 pounds on becoming president. Not the healthiest guy. He had kidney stones once in a while, so make sure you don't get hit in the kidneys when you can. Generally healthy, not quite the athletic record Reagan had, although he did serve in World War II and received a Silver Star when he was in the Naval Reserve after his aircraft it came under Japanese attack during an observation mission. But here's what really fascinates me about Johnson. It's the presence that he has. There is the psychological bullying and the intimidation he would use, especially when he was leading the Senate, called the Johnson treatment, where he would poke at people. He would put his arm around them and get very far into their personal space where they were practically face to face. If you just Google image Johnson treatment, you'll see people leaning as far back as they possibly can as he's leaning into them. Sometimes he would pick up smaller people by the lapels and lift them off the ground. What Hubert Humphrey described it as is when he entered a room, he came on like a tidal wave. He went through walls, he'd take over the whole room. At the same time, he seemed to have a preternatural capacity for quickly sounding the innermost truths of whoever was before him. The actual compulsions of vanity or ambition or grievance submerged beneath whatever the man might be telling him. So I think psychologically, this is something that's good. The trash talking, the getting in people's heads. I don't want to just cast this off to the side because other high performers had this ability too. One of them is Michael Jordan. He's famous for, of course, his natural athletic ability and finely honed basketball skills. But there are accounts of dozens of players who said Michael would taunt them specifically, get way inside their heads. They'd play terribly the rest of the game, sometimes for several games. In the back of the Chicago Bulls bus, he'd kind of keep everyone on edge and a little bit fear if he would single them out next. And that's kind of what LBJ did. We have the Johnson treatment and other factors that have become legendary thanks to the exhaustive biography by Robert Caro is how he would maintain himself in front of others. This gets back into his kind of psychological warfare of people. What Caro describes it, and I love this phrase, is he became fabled for a Rabelaisian earthiness. Rabelais is this French poet from the late Middle Ages, where he would urinate in the parking lot of the House office building whenever the urge took him. If a colleague came into the Capitol bathroom as he was finishing at the urinal there, he'd sometimes swing around still holding his member in hand. He called it jumbo and say, "Have you ever seen anything as big as this?" Or whatever foghorn, leghorn voice he talks in, and shake it around just to, it's really acting like it's exactly what a baboon would do to assert his supremacy amongst other baboons when they're trying to find out their pecking order there. So he would also oblige aides to take dictation, standing in the door of his office bathroom when he went about emptying his bowels. So I don't know if this is an intentional alpha male assertion ritual or he just didn't care at all about other people around him. But the levels of psychological manipulation is incredible. And again, these are humorous stories, but I really think there's something to this. And Robert Caro's entire book is about LBJ's mastery at manipulating power. Caro says, he made the Senate work. For a century before him, the Senate was the same dysfunctional mess it is today. He's the majority leader for 6 years. The Senate works. It creates its own bills. He leaves, and the day he leaves, it goes back to the way it was. So he's kind of like Moses. He just has this ability to take power and seize it and use it in ways that very few other politicians have been able to do. And then just one last thing about Johnson. Like James mentioned, he grows up in Texas. It's hill country. There's nothing there. You can get into scrabbles and you can get into fights. And for Johnson, he comes from a poor family. His father was ambitious, but in Johnson's eyes, an idealist, so he couldn't really get far in his attempts to climb the political ladder. So for Johnson, it's his naked desire to seize power and to hold on to it as tightly as possible so he doesn't fall into the same Texas backcountry that he came from. So that's LBJ, psychologically really profound guy. But is his lust for power enough to defeat the fit and trim Ronald Reagan?
Here's what happened. As soon as LBJ stepped into the ring, Reagan looked him right in the eye and said, "Go ahead, Lyndon. Make my day."
That's pretty good. Wow.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I grew up under listening to Reagan for 8 years make speeches, or more than 8, really. So Reagan wins. Reagan overcomes the height difference and that extreme confidence on LBJ's part, and he doesn't even let him get close enough to give him the Johnson treatment. 1, 2, 3, and that's the end of Johnson. Reagan wins.
All right, there you go. So he couldn't hold on to power that way. Well, in the final round, or the final fight of round 2, I should say, we're going to see 2 presidents show up who are seeded to the second round. That is George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, going up against Missouri's own Harry Truman. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.